Okay, so next we have Seema and Ashna are going to be presenting. Seema, you all know, I'm sure, very well, but in case you don't, she is a physician by background. She's been in the industry for almost 30 years. Woo, okay, fantastic. You might be one of the winners in the room. I don't know if I've got this written down, what we're going to talk about. You might have to say it yourself. No idea. Oh, yes, the presentation. And Ashna. We're going to have Ashna as well. Sorry, I should have read this again, shouldn't I? We've also got Ashna. Where's Ashna? There you are. Thank you, right in front of me. That's the trouble with wearing glasses, isn't it? They're for one thing, not two. So I can't actually see you. I can only see this, which is terrible. I apologise. So Ashna is... she's a PV associate at Essjay, and she's recently completed her Chartered Accreditation for UK Clinical Trial Regulation and MHRA Compliance. Well done. And she is here to talk about her findings from the course, so fantastic, thank you for doing that. And the presentation is on important regulatory updates over the last year in relation to drug safety and upcoming CIOMS guidelines, so pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was going to say, hopefully this isn't the time for everyone to fall asleep, but yeah, we thought we'd just cover a few of the regulatory updates. I think it's always helpful. We're going to cover the implementing regulation, E2D R1, the revision to ICH E2D, and then CIOMS, a few of the updates that are coming through, and then Ashna is going to talk about the clinical trial legislation changes for the UK. Right, so can you hear me okay? It's very loud here with that in the back. But implementing regulation, so as I'm sure... Yes. Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry. As I'm sure most of you know, we had the implementing regulation being amended. The 2012 implementing regulation was amended, and that came through in July. And that was really looking to reflect on what had been done previously since 2012, which was the major kind of legislative changes for PV that came through for the EU, and really provide a bit more guidance now that we'd had that experience. So looking at streamlining the processes, giving a little bit more advice as to what was needed. Various areas were covered, and just to show you, I've tried to line it up here so you can see where those changes were and kind of compress it down. So from the PSMF, your pharmacovigilance system master file perspective, there was guidance here with regards to what should be included from a deviation from your PV procedures, and that really you should only be including things that are significant to the PSMF, significant to your PV process as a whole and your PV system. That should be what's included, not everything. I think one of the big areas was subcontracting. And it was very clear in here that whilst you have a lot of subcontractors, what you do need to ensure is in your documentation, it's very clear as to what the roles and responsibilities are. There needs to be the obligations of third parties to exchange safety data if relevant. I mean, that was probably in place anyway from a contractual perspective. But I think the arrangements for inspection, auditing of the third parties, of the vendors, etc., that needed to be categorically stated within your contracts. Also to ensure that your third parties agreed to be audited on behalf of the MAH and also inspected by the National Competent Authority should that arise. So whilst I guess it's inferred, had to be absolutely written down now and agreed to within the contract. Also, for subcontracting, third parties shouldn't subcontract any of their tasks, PV tasks, without having in writing agreement from the MAH. And actually we did put that into place, certainly from our perspective within Essjay a little while ago, but it's definitely written there now. For your cases, I mean, again, talked about identifiable reporter, patient, adverse reaction, medicinal product, what makes a case valid, so there's a bit of information around that. For literature reports, talked about the digital object identifier, so very specific kind of requirements here. to add that in, if available, when you're reporting your case, and use the Vancouver style of referencing. And then for your post-authorization safety studies, there's an agency study register where you would need to enter the details of the protocol before you start your data collection. And then you would also need to upload your abstract of your final study report, and that's within 1 month of the finalization of that report, and then also your final study report. So again, very specifics with regards to what's required in these different areas. So for your periodic safety update report, so this is the document that you put in place once you're on the market, you review your safety data on a regular basis. You need to include when you've implemented your risk minimization measures, and any assessment of those risk minimization measures need to be within your PSUR. And I think what tends to happen is you do have a section in your report that talks about effectiveness, but generally people leave it a bit blank and don't really cover it properly. So it really is saying, look, we need to look at what risk minimization measures we've got in place for our products, and are they working correctly or properly or not? And how are we measuring that? How are we making sure that what we've got in place is working? If we look at audits, so the MAH should perform risk-based audits of quality systems, and that should be on a regular basis in regular intervals, and to ensure that all aspects of your PV system are covered. And needs to be conducted by someone who's not directly involved in or responsible for the area that is being audited. And again, I mean, this is a given, but it's written out in black and white. I think one of the other main areas was the signalling. So for those of you that remember, we had EVDAS, which is utilising vigilance for signalling to look for patterns for your drugs. There was a pilot, I can't remember exactly when it started, was it 2012 or was it just after? So just after 2012 basically, and they had a pilot where they had drugs where you needed to monitor vigilance to see if you could pick up any signals. And after a number of years of having to do that, they've realised that actually they're going to stop that pilot, and really what they just need you to do is to use vigilance to ensure that that's a source for your signalling. So you have to make sure that in your procedures you stated that vigilance will be used as a source to look into for safety data for your drug on a regular basis. And then they refer to your reporting terminology and standards, MHRA, and there's a whole list of things. I haven't put them here, but they talk about all of these ISOs. So I've just given you a bit of a flavour there, but you can have a look at the implemented regulation and see exactly what they refer to there. Okay, then on to ICH E2D Revision 1. So this is the guideline on post-approval safety data, definitions and standards for management and reporting of ICSRs. So it's about case reporting in the post-marketing setting. Originally published around 2003, and then the revision 1 was ongoing, adopted by ICH, which is a body that produces the guideline. That was in September, and what happens then, it comes into effect in the different countries. So Canada was January, EU is 18th of March, so quite soon, and the other countries, we haven't got a date yet as to when this is coming into place. So you end up then with a situation where some countries have adopted what's required of this guideline and other countries haven't, and that can cause a little bit of difficulty sometimes. Right, so I've tried to focus on the main changes, because whilst, I mean, it's very similar to the original ICH E2D with a little bit more clarification, but there are some big ticket items which I've tried to cover here. So these are what we would normally call special situations, and actually they've changed the definition to say other observations. So now we're not saying special situations anymore, they're called other observations, and those are things like your exposure during pregnancy, lack of effect, overdose, abuse, misuse. So, we were very much used to saying, these are our special situations, you need to capture these, you need to have them on your safety database, but now you'll need to say these are other observations instead of special situations. And then the other big change is the organised data collection system. So they've got a definition here. It's an activity gathering data relevant to the MAH's medicinal product or medical disease area in a planned manner, and enables you to review that data. And so basically it's when you have something in place where you're going out collecting that information and then you review that information. So again, before we'd probably say these are, well actually they still are, solicited sources. You're going out and asking for that information, but now they're called ODCS, your Organised Data Collection System. Now, in some countries, you may require a protocol for these organised data collection systems, so you could have a non-interventional study or a clinical trial, and there you will have a protocol and you will have your objectives, your design, methodology, etc. And that is in place then for those types of organised data collection systems. But now, there is also the requirement that if you don't have that in place and is considered an ODCS, that you then need to have a document that describes these areas. So you need to have a document that will say what is the objective of whatever you're doing. Where's the data coming from? What is the data set that you're going to receive and what are you going to do with that? And then also what is the process for collection of your adverse events, adverse drug reactions, other observations that are coming from that system. And then, of course, they say it excludes the spontaneous setting. So this is where you're actually putting something into place and going out and collecting that information. And just to give you a bit of an example of what's covered, things like clinical trials, non-interventional studies, but generally they will have protocols in place which will cover the items that were on the previous slide. Now, patient support programs is probably the big area. So if you've got a patient support program, you will, and it meets the definition. So you can see there that I've written that if you're just delivering drug at home and there's nothing else, that's not an organised data collection system. So you will have to have a mechanism to ensure that you review all of your PSPs or these types of activities to see if it meets the definition of an ODCS. If it does, then you will need to have a document that details what is it that you're doing, what is it you're collecting, how are you collecting it, how are you assessing that information too. So there are other examples here, market research being one. Again, that's probably when you go to a market research company, you'll have all of that. You should make sure that you have all of that information within the document that comes through for review when they're performing market research. But also you could have a product-specific analysis of consumer positivity or negativity about the product. Also any patient forum on a digital platform as well. So there are a few areas now that you're going to have to really delve into and make sure that you have categorised them appropriately and got the right documentation in place. Then one of the other areas that's covered is the literature, and there's quite a lot in ETD now about the literature, but I've just kind of highlighted a few things here. So you do still need to refer to your regional and local requirements. If you remember, ICH is global, it's meant to be implemented in all the different countries, so they're not going to say you need to do this for the EU, you need to do this for the US. It's up to the different territories to say, you know, what is relevant. But you do need to screen, as we know, local journals in some countries, certainly within the EU, that is an expectation. You need to assess for your adverse events, your adverse drug reactions, your cases, and when causality is not stated. So if you have a literature article and the author is saying that whatever the event is not related to the drug, your drug, then you can say, fine, we don't need to report that. But if they don't say that, you do need to assess, and you need to have a documented assessment to say why the company thinks that it's not related, the event is not related to your drug. So I think we'd gone from kind of a situation where you could assume that if they hadn't said it was causally related, that you didn't need to put these cases onto the database, to now again kind of going back to how it was in the old school way of assessing and ensuring that you are making that assessment and you're documenting your justification as to why that's not considered causally related to taking your drug. What happens in literature articles, as you all know, is that you will have your author will talk about an event and a drug, and then in a case they'll talk about all these concomitant medications. There could be, 15 things that the patient's taken. Your drug could be thrown in there, And what used to happen is you'd end up with that case on your database, even though it may not be considered related to your drug. Then they moved and went on to saying, right, okay, if you're a concomitant medication, you don't really need to put it onto the safety database, and now you do have to make that judgment call. So I think that's something that's slightly different. The other thing is that if you have a spontaneous observation, then that's a spontaneous report, but if you have a literature article that's a study in some way, then you need to classify that as a report from a study, organised data collection system. I know this is a bit heavy as a slide, but I thought, okay, I can't just talk about that and that only, but a lot of this is very similar to what it was in the prior ICH E2D. Your types of cases, your solicited or spontaneous solicited, like I said, when you go out and ask for that information, digital platforms and the fact that you need to regularly screen anything that's under the MAH responsibility, non-interventional studies, and then that differentiation between primary data and secondary data and what should be done from a safety perspective and case management perspective there. Regulatory authorities and that fact that you need to collect those cases, but you would only submit back to the regulatory authority if you had additional information. And then of course your important safety findings with regards to reporting as soon as possible according to local regional requirements if there's something that comes up that's not related to a case. So maybe you have a non-clinical study that shows that there's carcinogenicity in some way, you would need to report that in a specific time frame. So lack of efficacy, again, as it was before, you may need to report this for critical conditions, treatment of life-threatening conditions, vaccines, contraceptives, where there's a public health impact there. Expediting is the same, 15 calendar days, and then talks about day 0, very much the same. You may need to send other cases to regulatory authorities. In the EU, we need to send non-serious cases within 90 days. So again, it's making that reference to what can occur in the different countries and territories globally. Good case management, so ensuring that we've got accurate, authentic information, not duplicated, a clear MAH evaluation, and request to follow up should, obviously, depending on the case, kind of seriousness and expectedness, and then to get consent for case follow-up, because at the end of the day, you want to ensure you've got enough information to be able to make an appropriate medical judgment of what you're seeing. That's what then flows into your signalling, that's what flows into assessing whether you've got something that you need to look at further and enables you to perform that activity properly. Narrative, again, gives a good guidance with regards to how your narrative should be structured. You summarise all your relevant clinical information in a logical time sequence, in chronological order, regardless of how it's reported. And then causality, and then there's information about how to perform your causality assessment, taking into account, of course, we're used to doing this, the seriousness, evidence there, what other procedures have occurred, confounders, whether, drugs, how far after the drug's been taken has it occurred, and the outcome as well, so de-challenge, re-challenge. And then follow up and taking into account the fact that you've got privacy laws that are different globally and take that into consideration. So just as an aside, one of the companies that we're working with, from a narrative and a kind of a MAH evaluation perspective, they're using AI to write the company comment. The company comment, in some cases, is like 3 paragraphs compared to the narrative, which is like 4 sentences. Absolutely nuts, absolutely crazy. And it comes back to, I wasn't here yesterday, but I assume that what was said was that you do need to have someone looking at what is being produced to make sure that it's relevant and makes sense. Total nonsense, but okay, so CIOMS updates now. So I just thought it would be useful to kind of see where we are with CIOMS, because there are just so many now. They just keep going on and on, but here we go. Right, so CIOMS 12, I know you guys had the talk yesterday for the benefit risk balance, but for those of you who didn't, I'll just summarise a little bit here. This was published in May 2025, so obviously relevant to us. Talks about benefit risk and the formal structure of that assessment, the fact that it needs to be across the life cycle, so from early development to post-approval as well. It's all the way through. It doesn't just stop once you put your product on the market. And really it's about moving from that retrospective way of like trying to address issues once they've occurred to thinking about it proactively and dealing with it properly. Decisions need to be transparent, evidence-based, documented and fit for purpose. I mean, that feels quite standard and you would think that anyway, but it provides you with that framework to be able to do that. I think the changes to the earlier guidance are with regards to these new products that we were talking about. So we heard about the oligosense nucleotides, so the advanced therapy, medicinal products, gene therapy, things like that, because it's slightly different as to how you're looking at the benefit risk in these kind of products. Using new data sources, so real world evidence, patient preferences. Patient preference is extremely important now. Greater uncertainty at approval because you're trying to get your product onto the marketplace so it can benefit as many patients as possible earlier on, and then the need for that structured assessment at that time, and then increased expectation, as I said, for patients overall.
Do you need a time check? Just checking because there's two of you. I don't know.
How long have I?
Well, there's 20 minutes left roughly.
Okay, I think I've got probably 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, there's CIOMS 14, Artificial Intelligence in PV. This was published just last year, at the end of last year. Looking at, I mean, I'm not going to repeat all of this, but if we look at the core principles, it is a risk-based approach, making sure you have a human in the loop, etc. Validity, robustness, making sure that you can monitor that over time and prove that whatever you're using as an AI tool is appropriate. Transparency and be able to explain it. Data privacy is very important there. Fairness and equity, so avoiding bias, because we do know the AI tools are biased depending on data that they're using, and governance and accountability. Then we've got CIOMS 15, which is pharmacoepidemiology for public health, and this is launched in 2023, so it's ongoing at the moment. And really looking at having an inventory of situations, both real, theoretical, looking at the challenges of assessing impact on public health. They'll define whether a pharmacoepidemiological study would be appropriate or not, and what information that could generate. And then overall, they're talking about the timeline for setting up these kind of studies, limitations, looking at whether a study is needed or could you use something else instead. And then hopefully come up with a set of recommendations for different situations that you can then use. And then we got CIOMS 16, Development Safety Update Report. So that's started from Q1 2025, last year, looking at your Development Safety Update Report requirements. So you normally have a DSUR when you have a trial, and it really summarises all the information for your clinical trial drug. And here they're really looking at it and saying, is it fit for purpose? Maybe we need to talk about not just where all the studies are, just looking at the serious adverse events that you've seen in your trial, but look at more from a signalling, safety monitoring perspective. So at a higher level, really. Looking at the review of safety data relating to that investigational drug. Looking at your data safety monitoring board recommendations, your safety review committees, all of that should be in there, and it should be really refocused looking at that risk profile overall. Nowadays, with your DSUR, for certain countries, you do have to provide this information anyway. And I think they're wanting to say, yeah, we need to do this across the board globally. Really looking at a benefit risk analysis in the clinical trial setting and moving to what we have with the periodic benefit risk evaluation report in the post-marketing setting. So aligning it with that. And then the last one is CIOMS 17, long-term safety of medicinal products, and that was just started end of last year. And looking at how you deal with long-term safety concerns, have some case study examples and a framework for how to measure, monitor what you should be doing, and to look at your need for PV and risk minimisation measures overall in the long-term setting. So I will stop there, hand over to Ashna, and as Ashna is our PV associate, so be kind because she hasn't got too much experience in the clinical trial. So I'll hand over to Ashna now. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, good morning everyone. So for those of who I haven't met yet, I am the PV Associate here at Essjay and Sagittal. Last year I attended and I did a talk about nanotechnology, which was primarily my expertise and my background. But over the past year I feel like I've found my footing in PV, and so I feel like I can share a little bit of what I've learned with you, specifically with the UK clinical trial legislation updates. Let me go through the agenda. I'd like to preface, I'm not presenting as an expert in the field, but rather as someone who has recently been introduced to these reforms and wanted to share the key points that I've learned, particularly how the new UK clinical trial frameworks and ICH GCP E6 revision 3 is shaping the future of clinical trial oversight. My hope is that this session will help those who are also new to PV and clinical research and help them gain a clearer understanding of the upcoming UK legislative actions and how they may impact sponsors and trial conduct moving forward. So this slide is a very detailed overview of the new UK clinical trials framework and the key reforms involved. In simple terms, this is the biggest update to UK clinical trials in over 2 decades. It updates the old 2004 regulations and reflects a real shift in how clinical trials will be regulated going forward. The reforms were developed by the MHRA and the Health Research Authority, following consultations with industry, healthcare professionals and patient groups. In terms of why this reform is happening, Brexit created an opportunity for the UK to review and modernise its regulatory framework. The goal is to make the system more efficient and innovation friendly while still maintaining strong patient safety and transparency standards. I think these were like the key pillars of the framework. It's really about striking the balance between agility and protection. So looking at the timings, the regulations were signed into law in April 2025 and they'll come into full force on the 28th of April 2026. That transition period gives sponsors and organisations time to prepare for the changes. So what is actually changing in practice? I'll just briefly cover over this now, but I'll go into more detail in the following slides. Firstly, the approval process will become more streamlined. Instead of separate, sometimes duplicated reviews, there is now a more coordinated combined review process between the MHRA and the ethics committees. This should make applications clearer and more predictable. Secondly, the framework introduces a risk-proportionate approach. This means not all trials are going to be treated the same. So lower risk studies, for example, those using already approved medicines may follow a simplified pathway called notifiable trials, and higher risk trials will still undergo full scrutiny. There is also a stronger force on transparency. Sponsors must register trials publicly and publish results within set timelines, including lay summaries that patients can understand. Updates to the GCP and safety reporting aims to make oversight more focused and meaningful risks rather than excessive paperwork. So overall, the reform is trying to make the system smarter, faster where risk is low, and stricter where risks are higher, while still keeping patient safety at the centre. Just this one. Okay, so next I wanted to briefly touch on the new legislation, the ICH GCP E6 revision 3. So for those of you who went to the stream that Phyllis conducted yesterday, it was spoken about in detail on that stream. So Phyllis is our QMS lead here at Sagittal Pharma Consulting, so if anyone wants to know more information about that, I would highly recommend to reach out to her. But I'll just briefly touch on what I've learned. So this legislation was adopted in July 2025 and the updated guidelines formally embeds the concept of quality by design and emphasises end-to-end oversight across the entire clinical trial lifecycle, from protocol design through to conduct, monitoring and final reporting. So what is quality by design? This is, in fact, proactive approach to ensure trial quality rather than relying solely on retrospective monitoring and correction. It requires sponsors to identify critical to quality or CTQ factors at the design stage. These typically include participant safety and the reliability of trial results and data integrity. Sponsors must then systematically identify and assess risks that could impact these critical factors. The risks are then categorized, for example, as high, medium or low, and the appropriate mitigation strategies are implemented. An important component is the establishment of quality tolerance limits. These are predefined thresholds for key parameters. If these limits are exceeded, these triggers further evaluation and corrective actions. So all of this is documented within the risk management plan, which is maintained throughout the study and includes escalations or crisis management procedures where necessary. So training on this is provided here at Sagittal, and like I said, it's been conducted by Phyllis, so yes, please do reach out to her directly for more information. So moving now back onto a little bit about the background and the context of the reform. So this reform of UK clinical trial legislation was initiated in the post-Brexit regulatory landscape, as I've said. To understand why this reform is happening, it's helpful to look at the background. So previously, UK clinical trial legislations were based on the previous EU clinical trials directive. Even after Brexit, the UK framework was still largely derived from that original EU structure. So following UK's departure from the EU, there was an opportunity to review and update the system. So rather than simply maintaining that previous framework, regulators chose to modernise it, streamline it and strengthen it. The reform was developed collaboratively by the MHRA and the Health Research Authority, and importantly, it was done in isolation. It was informed by extensive public consultation, including input from industry, academia, and patient groups. So this isn't just a regulatory rewrite, it reflects stakeholder feedback and practical experience. I'm wary of time, so I'm just going to quickly breeze through this. How much time do I have?
Well, there's 10 minutes total.
10 minutes, okay.
Saving time for questions.
No, I'll just quickly go through some key objectives. So essentially what the legislation is trying to achieve. So the first objective is to enhance participant safety and transparency. While the UK already has strong safety standards, the reform strengthens oversight and places greater emphasis on public reporting of trials and results. This is about improving accountability and maintaining public trust in clinical trials. The second objective is to make the UK more attractive for global clinical research. In a competitive international environment, speed and clarity do matter. And by introducing faster approvals and clearer regulatory pathways, the UK aims to encourage innovation and attract investments within the life sciences sector. Another key objective is to introduce a proportionate, risk-based regulatory approach. So not all trials carry the same level of risk, so regulatory requirements should reflect that. Lower risk studies may follow simplified pathways, while higher risks or first-in-human trials continue to receive more intensive scrutiny. Finally, the reform aims to reduce unnecessary administrative burden. This includes streamlining submissions processes and reducing duplications between regulatory and ethics review. So the goal isn't to lower any standards, but to remove inefficiencies while maintaining strong participant protection. So I want to look specifically into the combined review, so one of the key operational changes under the new framework. So previously, sponsors would submit applications separately to the MHRA and to the Research Ethics Committee. Although reviews often happened in parallel, they were still technically separate processes. So under the formalised combined review process, there is now a single application submitted to both the MHRA and the RAC. This immediately reduces duplication and simplifies the submission process for sponsors. From there, the assessment is coordinated between regulatory and ethic reviewers. Instead of working in isolation, there is a structured communication and alignment in how the application is reviewed. Another important change is the introduction of statutory timelines, including a standard 30-day decision period for most applications. This gives sponsors more predictability around when they can expect a decision. Finally, there is greater clarity around requests for information and clearly defined clock stop provisions. This means that if regulators require additional information, the process for pausing and restarting timelines is transparent and structured. One thing that was highlighted throughout my training was that the combined review does not reduce oversight, but rather it improves the coordination. The aim is to make the process more efficient and predictable while still maintaining robust regulatory and ethical review. So while combined review focuses on improving how applications are processed, the next key change is to look at how trials are assessed, particularly in relations to risk. So one of the most important shifts in the new framework is the move towards risk-proportionate regulatory approach. So a key development in this introduction is what we are calling notifiable trials. These are designed for lower risk studies, typically involving authorized medicines used within standard clinical practice. So, like I've said, instead of going through the full authorization process, these trials may just follow a simplified notification route, rather allowing a faster start to the study. For higher risk trials, however, the full authorization process remains in place with enhanced scrutiny where appropriate. So it's clear the system still maintains strong and oversight is there for where risks are greater. Regulatory requirements, including safety reporting and documentations, are now scaled to the level of risk. The focus shifts towards clinical, meaningful risks rather than applying the same intensity of oversight across all the studies. Importantly, this approach aligns with the international risk-based principle, particularly the ICH E6 Revision 3, which emphasizes the quality by design and proportionate oversight. Another big thing was transparency and public disclosure. These were the center pillars of the new framework. Firstly, all clinical trials must now be registered on a publicly accessible registry within defined timelines. This ensures that trials are visible from the outset and helps prevent selective reporting and undisclosed studies. There are also clear requirements for sponsors to publish summary results within statutory timeframes. Importantly, this applies regardless of whether the results are positive, negative, or inconclusive. This strengthens scientific integrity and helps reduce reporting bias. So overall, these measures promote transparency throughout the entire trial lifecycle, from registration to result reporting. So I just want to quickly touch upon the practical implications for the sponsors. So the question is, what does all of this actually mean for sponsors in practice? So firstly, a separate UK authorization is still required. Applications must go through the MHRA process and are not covered under the EU Clinical Trial Information System. So for global studies, sponsors must plan for a distinct UK regulatory pathway post-Brexit. Secondly, organisations may need to review and update their SOPs. The formalised combined review process, the introduction of notifiable trials, and the updated safety and transparency requirements may require procedural updates, and training updates may also be necessary to ensure teams understand the new framework. When planning global development programs, UK statutory timelines should be factored into overall studies, startup strategies. Alignment between UK and EU submissions remain important, and sequencing consideration may be needed to avoid delays. Finally, systems must support the new transparency obligations. This includes ensuring that the trials registration, results, publications within required timelines and preparation of lay summaries can be managed effectively. It also requires cross-functional collaboration between regulatory, pharmacovigilance, clinical and medical writing teams. Sorry, that's a mouthful. So overall, while the reforms aim to streamline processes, it also requires proactive preparation. Sponsors who start planning early will be better positioned for the April 2026 implementation. So I'm just going back to the first slide just to wrap it up. The UK clinical trials, like I said, is the biggest UK clinical trial regulatory updates in over 20 years. At its core, it's doing four main things. First, make the approval process more efficient through combined review. Second, introduce a more proportionate risk-based approach. Third, increase transparency through mandatory registration, result publication and lay summaries. And fourth, clarify safety reporting and sponsor responsibilities while reducing unnecessary administrative burden. Overall, the goal is to create a regulatory system that is more streamlined, more proportionate and more transparent, while still keeping participant safety at centre. So as someone who's new to the area, what I've taken away from this is that the reform is about making the system smarter and more practical, and with implementations in April 2026, preparation and awareness will be key. Thank you for listening. Sorry if
Thank you very much. Fantastic. Does anyone have any questions, please? Or comments?
I've got a quick one. I can shout.
Go on then.
You know when you talked about clock stops, and if you don't know it, don't worry. And the regulatory authorities can ask for a clock stop. Can the ethics committees ask for a clock stop? Do you know?
That I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure
Yes,
about
they
that.
can.
Oh, they can. Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. Great.
I would assume so, I guess, because they both got their own things that all.
Yeah.
Anyone else, please?
The definition of the organised data collection systems, kind of extended access programmes on a named patient basis, would they go into there or not?
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not sure. I need to look at that.
But obviously, if you have the cohorts, so you have
Yeah,
a
I guess it
protocol.
depends on how you're collecting it. Yeah, but I need to look at that, to be honest. If I can come back. I don't know, does anyone know?
Yeah, it's very specific to national regulations. Because all of that, it's nowhere harmonized. So where you have a requirement for specific protocols, that
then it would
kicks
be.
in.
Yeah.
But in other countries, you're not even allowed.
Yeah. So sometimes it's considered spontaneous, sometimes it's considered. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any others?
I
Yeah.
just had a question around clinical trial regulations. Trial registration. Would that be clinicaltrial.gov, or is it something else?
So, again, I would assume that would be appropriate because that is publicly available.
So that will
So
not
really,
change.
although they are talking about it, I don't think it's a real change.
It will not
because you
change.
have to do that anyway. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Others? Anyone? Ask Charles to get a voice in the room. Yes, excellent.
Yeah, to Seema. I would like to ask about these, the PSPs, for example, as an organized data collection. What they're asking, is it like a document which will resemble like a protocol or something, or would it be sufficient to have
exactly.
to have an SOP that really generalizes? I mean, it could be an SOP maybe that encloses multiple PSPs, or does it need to be specific per PSP?
So, I mean, the way that I would look at it, it depends on individual PSPs and also depends on your individual PSP and how you're collecting that information. So if you've got a program that's across a couple of places and it's the same way of collecting, then obviously you could have one document.
Yeah.
But if you've got separate PSPs that have differing ways of collecting that information, then you need to have a separate document. But then again, that's just me thinking logically. So I'm assuming that that's what you would do.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Excellent. So thank you both very much. That's fantastic.